Hello. So today I put together this presentation. This is based off an astrological observation that I made about 2.5 years ago. I noticed a trend in a lot of high-profile criminals in their nativity having either a cardinal fire or a fixed water Venusian debilitation. And I thought that this was really interesting at the time, and I still think it's just as interesting now. However, I never really sat down and looked into it any deeper and analyzed their nativity and saw what else was going on here and if there were any consistencies between other debilities and dignities. So here, during this presentation, I'll be working primarily with classical and also post-classical applications. As a baseline, we'll be doing classical, but then later, as we get more into depth in the only time chart that I have in this presentation, we'll be going into some post-classical applications. So as I said, this is my original work and observation. A lot of astrologers do things like this. They will be examining a certain area in history, and they will notice some planetary trends, um, things that go on for certain things, and how different planets correspond and how they interact and how it can influence physical phenomena. So again, we're going to be examining the natal charts of several high-profile criminals, and I'm drawing primarily from Ptolemaic essential dignities and debilities and medieval renditions from William Lilly, who is a post-classical medieval astrologer. And later, I'll briefly, very briefly, touch on the work of Reinhold Everton. Each of these cosmological constitutions contains a Venusian debility, which, according to the rendition of Lilly on Ptolemy's work, designates and represents a wide range of accidental or essential qualities and stellar conditions. These charts also contain other accidental and essential dignities and debilities, which I did notice through doing this, aside from Venus. But I will mostly be focusing on debilities and exile, or when I say debility, I mean detriment, or when I say detriment, I mean debility, and fall or exile. So when I say fall, I mean exile, or when I say exile, I mean fall. However, I will also be pointing out domiciles or sine and cosine rulership and exaltations or elevation. So just a very brief, basic outline of the core difference between classical and post-classical applications with the essential debilities and dignities. So according to Ptolemy in his Tetrabiblios, all four major essential dignities operated with equivalent strength to define a planet's fundamental state. So very baseline. And then for post-classical or medieval, astrologers like Guido Bonatti and William Lilly introduced a more detailed and comprehensive framework to Ptolemy's work. And their hierarchy made the most important essential essential dignity a domicile. Uh, and because detriment corresponds to the sign opposed to domiciles, these will be the focus. So if you don't understand that, you will now. So just a very basic overview of the concepts during this content that we'll mostly be focusing on as our core classical foundation. So detriment or debility, this posits that a planet is in detriment when it's placed in the sign exactly opposite its domicile. So sine or cosine rulership, and that the planet feels trapped in a foreign and hostile environment, unable to express its core nature. Debilities occupy the signs opposed to occupancy of domicile. So example, Mars rules Scorpio and Aries opposes Libra, and Scorpio opposes Taurus, therefore Mars is debilitated in Libra and Taurus, while Venus rules Taurus and Libra, therefore Venus is debilitated in Aries and Scorpio, which again, we're dealing with Venusian debilitations here. So according to domicile or sine and cosine rulership, this is where a planet feels most authentic because it's at home in the zodiac sign that it rules. For example, Mars rules Aries, therefore Mars in Aries in someone's nativity is domiciled. As for fall or exile, so this posits, and it is viewed as the most extreme form of debility. I believe that that was actually according to the post-classical, and that it represents deep powerlessness and a loss of status or extreme corruption. A planet in its fall, this occurs when it is in the sign exactly opposite its exaltation sign. So, for example, the sun is in fall in Libra because it opposes its exalted sign of Aries. So, Scorpio actually doesn't have a exaltation in the classical system. In the Uranian system, it does. Uranus is exalted in Scorpio, so therefore, an additional fall for Taurus would be Uranus, but that's a really bad example because that's dealing with Uranian, and that's not even what we're doing now, so I don't even know why I mentioned it. Exaltation or elevation. So this posits that a planet operates at its most idealized potential, and it functions with exceptional ease and strength. So, for example, again, drawing from this first description, the Sun is exalted in Aries, uh, and then I believe the Moon is exalted in Taurus, just as another example. So an overview of the concepts again. So this is from both classical and post-classical. So for diurnal sect, we will briefly touch on some sect when I get into the time chart, and that's really the only time it will come up, obviously, because it's the only time chart. So diurnal sect, this means that the sun is above the horizon or the ascendant and descendant axis. So you can kind of see how it corresponds here to the Occidental. Um, and then nocturnal sect, this means that the sun is below the horizon or the ascendant and descendant axis. Um, so then here with Oriental position, planet to the right of the sun, that it rises before the sun. So you can see this is a pretty good example, this diagram. So here's the sun. I mean, it's right on the degree of the descendant, or what I'm assuming is the descendant, even though this is not. Oh yeah, no, that is the descendant. I don't know. This is not a good example for that, but you can kind of see how you would look at this chart, and for me, I would say that this is a nocturnal sect because the sun is right there on the descendant. What we're assuming is the descendant for the purpose of this conversation. So, therefore, um, it's it's doing a bunch of things. According to the medieval astrologers, it hands over authority to a malefic and a benefic. In the instance that it was above the horizon, it would hand over that authority to a different malefic and benefic. So then for Occidental position, this says that a planet is to the left of the sun and that it sets after the sun. So you can kind of see here, for Occidental, these are the planets to the left of the sun, they're setting after the sun. Therefore, according to the post-classical work of William Lilly, there are going to be different conditions for those planets, and same for Oriental. And then down here, I just have a description of some things that William Lilly says. He says that Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, when Oriental, or behind the sun, are in accidental fortitude. Fortitude was what he called dignity, and that Mercury and Venus, when occidental or before the sun, are in accidental fortitude, again, accidental dignity. And then Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, when occidental or before the sun, are accidentally debilitated, and that Mercury and Venus, when oriental or behind the sun, are accidentally debilitated as well. So this is the post-classical concepts that I'll be going through according to Will Lilly. So he talks about this thing called Besiegement, which he says is an accidental debility, and this is where a planet is trapped between the malefic rays of Mars and Saturn, which are the two malefics. And he also talks about Combustion, which he also says is accidental debility, and he says that this is where a planet is within. He actually said within 8.5 degrees of the sun, but I just put 8 degrees here because it's still within 8 degrees. And he also says that house placement can constitute either an accidental or essential fortitude or debility. Um, uh, dignity. Dignity for fortitude. Remember that. Don't let my fucking bullshit confuse you, okay? So he says that any 12th, 8th, or 6th house placements indicate accidental debility, whereas 10th, 1st, 7th, 4th, 11th, 2nd, 5th, 9th, or 3rd house placements indicate accidental fortitude or dignity. And although there were many other characteristics, many included in Lily's system, these were what I will be focusing on. I felt that these were most relevant to the only time chart of a high-profile criminal that I have in this presentation. So, giving a bit of history, and I hope that this can make sense. I hope this can help make sense for the concepts that we're dealing with in this content. So, in the 2nd century, in the Common Era, Claudius Ptolemy, he wrote a book called Tetrabiblios, in which he outlined basic essential dignities and debilities, which, again, were renditions of Actually, I don't think I've mentioned it yet. I think I was mentioning it here. These were his renditions of the Egyptian orders. And this posited that celestial bodies, so that being the traditional planets, or the planets that went up towards Mars in the pre-Uranian revolution, physically influence earthly and human affairs through changing conditions. And these corresponded to planetary states via modality, so cardinal, fixed, or mutable quality, sign quality, which was developed and refurbished from, again, just mentioned this, from the Egyptian orders, which says term, face, or bounds, and triplicity. And that I really won't be going into any detail about this. I'll just briefly outline it in here, but these are pretty much already as a fundamental thing built into this, built into Ptolemy, so classical and post-classical renditions. The core premise of Ptolemy's essential dignities and debilities is that a planet's strength, comfort, and ability to express its true nature depend on these conditions, which can invoke structural harmony or disorder. And these positions consist of major qualities such as domiciles, exaltations, and then minor qualities, which again are built in. And really, I will not be mentioning these, so you don't need to worry about this as much. This is just fundamental to the concept. So this includes triplicities, which divide the elements, so fire, earth, air, and water, and assigns 3 planetary rulers to each element based on sect. And then for terms and bounds, or bounds, I should say, means basically the same thing, it's interchangeable. Designates 5 subdivisions of a whole sign and assigns each subdivision 1 of 5 planets, excluding the luminaries. And then face or decan or dacan or deacon, however you want to say it, everyone says it a different way. These are linked to harmonics, which I'm no good at, and split each sign into 3 equal 10-degree parts, which correspond to the Chaldean order meaning the order of the planetary orbits. So that goes from Mercury to Saturn. That actually does include the luminaries, but anyway, it's irrelevant. Noting that other Hellenistic or classical astrologers also developed renditions of the Egyptian orders, but Ptolemaic constitutions are core. That's just a given. So, like Ptolemy, post-classical and medieval astrologers like Lilly also had a system for this. But unlike Ptolemy, Lilly's system organized dignity, or what he called fortitude or debility, through essentiality or accident. And this was really quite comprehensive. This system was more comprehensive. Lilly says that exaltation and domicile is essential fortitude and therefore detriment are essential debility. Okay, so this is important. This was his hierarchy in comparison to Ptolemy's. So, again, later contemporaries wrote about their own interpretations of classical and post-classical work. That's what we do. That's what everyone does who is working in a specific field and doing certain things and certain research. There were many, many, many of these, but again, I will briefly, very briefly, draw on the work from Reinhold Eberton in his combination of stellar influences. So this is, again, how planets correspond depending on which planets they are, and what other planets they're aspected to. So, interesting story. This is something that's cool about him. He was arrested and interrogated by Nazi officials as a part of a broader crackdown on astrologers and occultists. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of the ones who got lucky because he made it out alive. He didn't kill himself. He didn't get killed. I believe he passed away in the 1980s, and I think he also ended up in the United States, like a lot of the other astrologers in Europe at the time. So, disclaimer. Through analyzing these charts, uh, and others that didn't make the cut, not all high-profile criminals have a debilitated Venus. I did examine several other charts, untimed, of high-profile criminals. One example being Pablo Escobar, didn't have a debilitated Venus. Another example being Jack Ruby, didn't have a debilitated Venus. Another chart that I saw was John Hinckley Jr. He didn't have a debilitated Venus. I actually think all of the names I just mentioned had their Venus in Pisces. I'm pretty sure. But don't quote me on that. And that not all individuals with a debilitated Venus are predetermined to become high-profile criminals. That's not why I'm here. That's not why I'm doing this. I'm not designating, making these dichotomies. I'm not here to do this. I just think that this is very interesting, and I think that there are many other astrologers out there who will find this interesting. And that was my next point. This is the purpose of this presentation. This is an astrological observation that I myself made. As far as I'm concerned, this is original. I haven't seen anything else like this done before, and I really hope that other astrologers will find it interesting. And there are also, and I won't go into too much depth about this, but I will just try as we're going through in passing to make mention of this. But there were some pretty clear and interesting outer planetary influences that contributed or could possibly contribute to these individuals' crimes. I won't be going into a great amount of detail about this, but it's still very interesting, something that I observed, and I want to lay it out because maybe some other astrologers are going to see this and they're going to see it too. So in this presentation, I have 12 charts. Only one is timed, and this is a big one. I think you guys are gonna like this. So we're gonna be using this as the primary example to contrast with other charts, okay? And that's where we're gonna go into the work of Lilly. Most of these Venus positions are debilitated via cardinal fire or Aries. Very interesting that less are debilitated via fixed water. Again, I don't have every single natal chart for every single high-profile criminal that existed throughout history, but disproportionately for the charts that I have available here, most of these are debilitated via Aries. Very interesting, and I think it's interesting how you can see very striking and some less striking differences in not just the person, depending on their Venusian debility, whether it's cardinal fire or fixed water, but their crimes and what motivated their crimes and how they carried out their crimes, depending on, or we're theorizing that it could be dependent on, the Venusian debility. So very interesting. And we will briefly compare the nature of these people's crimes and how these differences may have substance within essential debility. Very, very interesting. Okay, first chart we have. First high-profile criminal where I identified a fixed water detriment. We will be dealing with scorpionic Venusian debilitations first, then we will get into the cardinal fire Aryan Venusian debilitations, because disproportionately, again, there are more. Katherine Knight, Australian murderer who attempted to cannibalize her partner. She was the first woman in the country's history to be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This is something that comes up regardless of the sign debilitating Venus. They seem to have made history in particular, and there are other particular ways, but within the context of this conversation, with being sentenced to a specific sentence for the first time in history in a country, nation, state, whatever, or that they were the first person executed in a certain state or country in a while. Very interesting. She stabbed her partner to death and skinned him. Also, trigger warning, there will be some crazy shit talking about in here. Okay, obviously we're dealing with high-profile criminals. It's some crazy shit. If you don't want to listen, don't listen. She cooked his head and parts of his body with the intention of feeding them to his own children. Crazy bitch. Fortunately, she was stopped by police before this could happen. Thank God, right? She is a notorious figure in Australian crime history, one of the most notorious, probably next to Ned Kelly. She was raised in a dysfunctional environment. She was assaulted by her alcoholic father and other family members, and she expressed a disdain for the opposite sex. This is something that comes up. I only have two females in these examples. Both of them, both have Venusian debilities. The other one was cardinal fire, but both express hatred for men, and both of their crimes were directed towards men. This is something else very, very interesting. I'll be speaking about this at the end. So, she experienced delinquency. She first stabbed a boy in high school out of self-defense, and at 15 she left school to pursue her dream job at an abattoir. Wow, interesting. She developed an early infatuation with knives. So, here we see, for our additional identifiers, her sun was in its sign of fallen Libra. Her moon could have been in its sign of detriment, but it's untimed, so we don't know for sure. So the moon sign of detriment being cardinal Earth, Capricorn. And her Mars is in its sign of detriment in cardinal air, Libra. And then for primary, we have her Venus debilitated in fixed water, Scorpio at 13 degrees right here. So the core themes in Katherine Knight's nativity. and her story. She was a murderer. She had a dysfunctional childhood. She experienced delinquency. She experienced sexual assault. She expressed a hatred for men. She's a notorious crime figure. And she's the first woman in Australia's history punished with a specific sentence. Very notorious. Ted Bundy. Fixed water detriment. American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, and murdered dozens of young women and girls. He would convince his victims that he needed assistance by duping them into believing that he was an authority figure. Very calculated. This was his method. This was his modus operandi. He would bludgeon them unconscious, then restrain them with handcuffs before driving them to a remote location to be assaulted and killed. He engineered 2 incarceration attempts and committed further assaults after he escaped. They weren't actually attempts. He did escape successfully. These included 3 murders, and then he was recaptured again. He apparently described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet, and he never knew who his biological father was. This is something else. This comes up a lot. Lack of strong parental figures. We see this particularly with these fixed water debilitations, with these male criminals. So, he's Saturn for additional identifier, Saturn in sign of detriment, fixed fire in Leo. And for primary, his Venus is debilitated via fixed water Scorpio, right here at 20 degrees. So core themes. He committed several murders and assaults targeting women. Again, Katherine Knight. We saw the example of her having a disdain for men, and that her crime was directed towards a male. So very similar to the male criminals, in the sense that they express disdain for the opposite sex. This is, in my opinion, very, very Venusian debilitation characteristic. He was calculated, he was cunning, he was educated and astute. I believe he was educated as a lawyer. I don't know which university, but apparently he harbored exceptional intelligence. He successfully escaped prison twice. He never knew who his biological father was, and he is a notorious crime figure. Charlie Manson, another fixed water detriment, spent more than half of his life in correctional institutions. He lacked a strong parental figure. He never met his biological father. He was sent to a school for delinquents where he apparently experienced sexual assault. He did contradict himself a bit on this. Sometimes he would say that he didn't, other times he would say that he did. But it is a part of his story, it's a part of his history, it's a part of his biography. Again, very Venusian debilitation right there. He built a cult following of young people in San Francisco who went on to both embody and shape the Haight-Ashbury epicenter of 1960s counterculture. He was a big pioneer in this movement in some sense, you know. These young kids, they were feeling lost. They were feeling angry. They had animosity for the world around them, the way that the world was irritating, and he's what the law enforcement called a charismatic leader. He had a way with words. He had the gift of the gab. He could get these lost young people in and get them to do things for him. He became affiliated with well-known musicians and musical producers in California, and he had his own music stolen from the Beach Boys, and Manson remains uncredited to this day. So that was for the song Cease to Exist. The Beach Boys renamed it Never Learned Not to Love. And I believe Guns N' Roses as well. They took one of his songs that he originally wrote and they chopped it up a bit. He still remains uncredited. And Manson was famously instrumental in orchestrating several murders in California, including the very high-profile murder of actress Sharon Tate, which is mostly what he's known for. So for our additional identifiers, his moon could be in its sign of detriment, but it's untimed, so in Capricorn, and then his Saturn is in sign of domicile in Aquarius to 21 degrees. And then for our primary, his Venus is in its sign of detriment in fixed water Scorpio here at 18 degrees. Core themes. Never knew who his biological father was. He grew up in corrections and juvenile detention. He was a delinquent. He experienced sexual assault. He became a charismatic leader and eventually a pop culture icon. He instructed several murders. He's a notorious crime figure. He harbored a radical ideology in several ways. He inspired further violence, and he experienced substance abuse. Okay, I believe this is our final fixed water debility. This is Lee Harvey Oswald. He was placed in an orphanage, and he was also briefly raised by his relatives. He also lacked strong parental figures. He was placed in juvenile detention at a young age, during which he was assessed by a psychiatrist and deemed emotionally disturbed. He suffered an injury at a young age. This is something else that comes up a lot. As a child, he was described as withdrawn and temperamental. Also something else that comes up a lot. Allegedly, he struck his own mother and threatened his sister-in-law with a pocket knife. He was court-martialed twice and jailed by the United States Marine Corps. So he has some military experience. Again, something else that does come up a lot. He became interested in Marxism and defected to the Soviet Union. Again, this radical ideology. He shot and killed then President John Frederick Kennedy, and 45 minutes later he murdered a Dallas police officer. And 2 days later, he was murdered himself by Jack Ruby on live television, so very high profile. So for his nativity, for our additional identifiers, we see his sun in its sign of fall. In Libra, we see his moon in its sign of detriment in Capricorn. Again, even though it's untimed, we can still see that's a good window to work with. We can see it's clearly in Capricorn. We just don't know the exact degree. It's assuming a time because there's no houses. And then Saturn is in its sign of fall in Aries. For our primary identifier, his Venus is debilitated via fixed water Scorpio here at 5 degrees. So core themes. He lacked strong parental figures. He was put up for adoption. He was sent to juvenile detention. He engaged in delinquency. He experienced an injury in childhood. He was confrontational. He had a military experience. He harbored radical ideology. He was a notorious crime figure and pop culture icon and still is. He changed history, and he himself was murdered. So, we're moving on to cardinal fire debility. This is Aileen Wuornos. She never met her father, who apparently was sentenced to life imprisonment for some pretty messed up stuff, and he committed suicide in prison. Her mother abandoned her, and she was raised by her grandparents, who she said were alcoholics, and she also said that her grandfather assaulted her. By age 11, she began engaging in sexual activity in exchange for cigarettes, drugs, and food. She became pregnant at 14 after being raped by a friend of her grandfather, who said that she had to give up the child for adoption. She was forced to do that. Between ages 14 and 22, she attempted suicide 6 times. While engaged in street prostitution, these were her crimes. She shot, killed, and robbed 7 of her male clients, initially claiming that her victims had attempted to assault her and that these homicides were committed in self-defense. But she later abandoned this idea. She, again, similar to Manson, contradicts herself in some ways. And she was the second female executed in Florida since 1976. Okay, for our additional identifiers. Her moon could be in its sign of fall, but it's untimed. Fall being the sign of Scorpio, pretty small window we're working with there, but it's still possible. Her Mars is in its sign of exaltation, in Capricorn, 0 degrees according to this chart. And for our primary identifier, her Venus is in sign of exile in our first cardinal fire debility during this presentation, in Aries, at 21 degrees. Core themes: sexual assault, hatred for men, crimes directed towards males. So we saw this as well. We've seen this previously with Bundy, and we've seen it with Knight. She never met her father, and she was abandoned by her mother. Again, like this strong parental figures. She was engaged in sexual licentiousness. She engaged in delinquency. She experienced psychological distress. She had several suicide attempts. And she was the first execution by state in a while. She experienced substance abuse. And she's a notorious crime figure. All of these ones are. Okay, so this is kind of where we're starting to get into our outer or generational planetary influence. Very interesting. Luigi Mangione. Or Mangione, however you say it. Very different to the ones we've seen previously. So he developed an early interest in coding. With our timed chart, we'll see a similarity with this as well. With these techie things, we'll see a couple things come up with this later. Apparently he co-founded an iOS game and a development company. Interesting. He harbored exceptional technological skills. He was fascinated by artificial intelligence and largely pro-technology and secular in his outlook. Again, this outer and generational influence we'll see through Pluto, through Uranus, and through Neptune. This techie adept inclination. This comes up. He graduated from high school as a valedictorian, again, astute academic. He completed a bachelor's and a master's in engineering. This is something that comes up a lot as well. These people, a lot of these high-profile criminals, they're educated in engineering. He was accused of killing health insurance CEO, which instigated a nationwide manhunt. It was very, very big at the time, and still very is. Once he was detained, he was found with a 3D printed gun, a 3D printed suppressor apparently, and also found with a fake driver's license and that he operated under an alias with this license. This is something that comes up as well. They operate under aliases. The identity, the Venusian identity, it's debilitated, or at least they've attached an identity to that debilitation. He has been described as the most polarizing murder suspect in American pop culture, and that he exemplifies frustrations current in American society. I actually agree with that. He is celebrated as a folk hero and said to have inspired further acts of violence. Many of these people mentioned have. And that apparently he's regarded as an online sex symbol, which, I think that's true. Again, this Venusian debility, this cardinal 5 Venusian debility, a sex symbol. There's something that's very Aryan Venusian about that. Okay, so for our additional identifiers, Mars is in its sign of detriment here in Taurus. Jupiter is domicile in Pisces, and his Saturn is in its fall in Aries. And then for our primary identifier, his Venus is debilitated here in Aries at 3 degrees, cardinal 5 debilitation. Core themes, technologically adept. You can see it back there. I forgot to point it out, but here's Pluto. That's a Sagittarian Pluto. Uranus, Aquarian Uranus. And same with his Neptune, Aquarian Neptune. This is very pervasive with that technological inclination with the outer or generational planets. And I know, because I have the same one, only mine plays out differently because we do not have the same chart. We are not the same person. He was very educated and astute, studied engineering, bachelor's and a master's. He harbored a radical ideology that led to murder. He used an alias, operated under an alias briefly. He's become a pop culture icon and a sex symbol. And he also inspired further violence. Okay, El Chapo, another cardinal fire debility. He endured physical abuse as a child. He's a former drug lord and top leader of a cartel. This is incredible. But apparently, oh, can I not go back? Oh, I can't go back. Well, that's fun. Okay. But apparently he was responsible for over 34,000 murders, which is crazy. I really can't go back. Wow, I can't go back to the other slide. I guess you're just gonna have to go back and pause it and read it. But from memory, he pioneered a very interesting technique in drug smuggling, where they would operate through tunnels, exchanging in countries' borders to smuggle drugs into the United States and into Europe as well. So we're gonna have to keep going. It's all right. So for our additional identifiers, his sun is in its sign of exaltation in Aries. His moon could be exalted, but it's untimed. Exalted being in Taurus. Again, we have a very small window we're dealing with there, so it's probably not exalted, but it's still possible. And his Jupiter is in its sign of detriment, which is here in Virgo, in mutable Earth. And for our primary identifier, his Venus is debilitated via cardinal fire Aries, here at 12 degrees. Core themes: experienced childhood abuse, several murders and assaults, apparently 34,000 of them. Confrontational, he changed history. Oh, this was another thing as well. He escaped prison twice. He bribed the prison guards. He's a notorious crime figure. He's heavily referenced in media and television, and he's responsible for inspiring Uh, Figures in media and television, and he evaded responsibility for a very long time. Okay, another Australian criminal, high-profile criminal. Cardinal fire debility, Thomas Sewell. He's intellectually dishonest. He was born in New Zealand, and he moved to Australia as a child, so he himself was an immigrant. But he hates immigrants, and he built his ideology and his movement off that. He served in the Royal Australian Army's Infantry Division. Again, another military person that we have coming up. He also studied engineering, planetary outer generational influence. He professed views indicative of neo-Nazi philosophy and formed several radical groups in Australia driven by a disdain for Australian immigration policy, left-leaning politics, and Jewish people. He also very famously attempted to recruit Brennan Tarrant, who was the eventual perpetrator of the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. He eventually became the most controversial and high-profile white supremacist in Australian contemporary society, and pretty much still is, even though he's not operational anymore. He was both accused of and charged with several public assaults against civilians, which again, he himself is. He maintained his influence and leadership throughout Nazi circles until the Australian government established hate crime laws that criminalized the organization of hateful radical groups. He can't do it no more, at least not publicly. Despite his views on traditional family values, he engaged in sexual debauchery and unfaithful behavior with several women aside from his partner. So, again, intellectually dishonest. And he experienced issues with his mother. Okay, for our additional identifiers. Mercury in its sign of detriment in Pisces. Mars is in its sign of fall in Cancer. Saturn is domiciled in Aquarius. We've seen that a couple times. Interesting, but again, I won't be going into detail about any of these other additional identifiers. And then for our primary identifier, we have a Venusian debilitation cardinal fire here in Aries at 19 degrees. Core themes: radical ideology, notorious crime figure and cultural icon. Committed several assaults, has a military experience, very confrontational. Studied engineering, sexual licentiousness, and intellectually dishonest. Okay, Ramzi Yusuf, another cardinal fire detriment with Venus. His real name is unknown, and he's gone by an alias for the entire time he has been a high-profile criminal, and maybe even before that. Ramzi Yusuf isn't even his real name. He studied electrical engineering in Wales before returning to the Middle East and began learning to make explosives. He was one of the main perpetrators and apparently masterminded, if you know, you know, masterminded the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1994 bombing of the Philippines airline flight. I can't remember the number of the flight. And he was also a co-conspirator in the Bojika plot. I think I'm saying that word right. He killed 6 people, or the things that he did, killed 6 people and injured 1,042 other people through loading a rental truck with explosives during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So take note of this. Rental truck with explosives. Take note of that, okay? Because we're dealing with a couple people who actually crossed paths. Their crimes led them into the same institution, into the same federal prison. And we're going to see some very clear themes, especially with these people who, at some point, ended up under the same roof. Here we are. Through meeting him in prison, Ted Kaczynski wrote that Yusuf was a habitual liar. True story. So we have this intellectual dishonesty coming up again. Okay. So for our additional identifiers, Moon could be exalted, but it's untimed. Again, we're dealing with a very small window, so it probably is exalted, but you never know, there's still a chance it might still be in Aries. His Mars is in its sign of detriment, right here in Taurus. And his Saturn is in its sign of exaltation here in Aries. And for our primary identifier, his Venus is debilitated via cardinal fire Aries, right here at 22 degrees, and it's retrograde. I won't be pointing any of these retrogrades out with any of the traditional planets, but hey, I'm putting this out here so other astrologers can see my original work and then see other things that come up, and they themselves are going to get interested, and they might be interested by whether or not these debilities are coming up retrograde or not, or which motion they're going on in, or whether they're applying or separating into aspects to other additional debilitations or dignities. Core themes: operated under an alias and still does. Harbors a radical ideology. Studied engineering. He orchestrated several attacks, assaults, and bombings. We're starting to get into the bombings now. Committed several murders. Intellectually dishonest. A notorious crime figure and changed history. Okay. David Berkowitz. Yep, that's right. I mean, who would have thought, right? Probably the one of the main people, in my opinion, who in this presentation really exemplifies this. Granted, not a time chart, but there's a lot of things that he experienced in his life that I think really they scream Venusian debility in Cardinal Fire Aries. So within a few days of his birth, his biological mother gave him up for adoption. At an early age, he became infatuated with petty larceny and starting fires. He suffered injury at a young age. Again, we saw this come up with Oswald, and we'll see it come up with another chart, another two charts as well, actually. Relatives recall that he was a difficult sport and bully in his youth. At age 14, his adoptive mother died of breast cancer. He joined the United States Army after high school and served in the Korean War. And upon returning to the United States, he began committing violent crimes. Again, this military experience. He committed a stabbing and a series of shootings in New York City. He killed 6 people and wounded 11 others. And allegedly, he claimed part of his motivation for this, or it's kind of similar to Wernos and Manson, contradicted himself. Half the time, he was saying that he was motivated by an animosity towards women. And then other times he would claim that he was motivated by elements of the dark arts and Satanism. And interesting, once he was incarcerated, he professed his faith as a born-again Christian. So maybe we'll see, did Jupiter come up here? Yeah, Jupiter did come up here. Okay, so for our additional identifiers, Moon could be in its sign of detriment, but it's untimed. In detriment being in Capricorn. Domiciled Mercury, right here in Gemini. This is something that came up a little bit as well. Jupiter in sign of detriment, which is right here in Gemini as well. And then Saturn is in sign of exaltation, right here in Libra, also retrograde. For our primary identifier, we have Venus in sign detriment in Cardinal Fire Aries here at 27 degrees. Core themes: delinquency, military experience, injury in childhood, psychological distress, put up for adoption. We've seen that a bit as well. Committed assaults and murders directed mostly at women, or at least said. Sometimes he would say this, other times he would say it wasn't that. Contradicting himself, again, intellectually dishonest. He harbored a radical ideology. This one was a bit different from the other ones we've seen, though. This one was more dogmatic. Or at least he said it was. And he is a notorious crime figure, particularly in New York City. Okay. Ted Kaczynski. Experienced injury in childhood. I'm not going to get into detail about this, but, it's the information's out there if you want to find it. He skipped the 6th grade after being tested for an IQ of 167. He considered this a pivotal moment as it led to him feeling socially inadequate, and he skipped the 11th grade and graduated high school at age 15. He attended 3 universities and eventually earned a PhD in mathematics. Described as smart but a lonely individual. He participated in a study led by a former OSS psychologist, and this led people to theorizing that he became deeply disturbed by this study. Not going to go into detail about this. I don't necessarily subscribe to that idea, but, if that's what you're about, then that's what you're about. I'm just laying out the things that scream Venusian debilities that have happened throughout these people's lives, and regardless of whether that's what the study was about or not. Either way, still very Venusian debility, indicative of that at least. He experienced the desire to receive a sex change, but later decided against it. Very Venusian debility, in my opinion, particularly with Aries. He made observations that led to him developing a disdain for society propelled technologically, and he eventually moved into the wilderness and lived as a hermit. And he decided on getting revenge on the system for viewing it as a threat to the wilderness, or what he called wildness. He carried out a 17-year bombing campaign which led to the death of 3 people and injury of 23 others, and he also evaded responsibility for that time. We've seen that a couple times as well, whether it was through prison escapes or through just evading law enforcement for extended periods of time. And he was reported to have committed suicide in prison while suffering from cancer, and he also had a few previous, at least one recorded previous suicide attempt. There may have been others, I don't know. So, for our additional identifiers, we have a domiciled Mercury here in Gemini. We have Mars in its sign of fall in Cancer. We've seen a lot of martial exaltations throughout these criminals. But with this one and with Thomas Sewell, we have a martial debility. And his is actually, according to this chart, even though it's untimed, it's squared his Venusian debility here in Aries. And his Jupiter is in its sign of detriment in Gemini. Nice Gemini stellium going on there. And then for our primary identifier, we have, of course, our Venusian debility here in Cardinal Fire, Aries, and according to this untimed chart, it's 18 degrees. So, core themes. Experience bitter feelings for women, confusion over his sexuality, injury in childhood, educated and astute, suicide and suicide attempts, psychological distress, radical ideology, disdain for technology. So, unlike Mangione, and the next chart that we're going to get to, this one's a bit different. There's some technological elements here, but rather than being largely pro-technology like Mangione, he had a disdain for technology, and Ted came from the era of, I believe, Plutonian Leo, okay? And he had a domiciled Uranus. His Neptune, I can't remember, but you can go back and have a look at the chart if you want to see it. Committed several murders, bombings, he evaded responsibility, and he is a pop culture icon. Okay, the only time chart we have. This is it. Timothy James McVeigh. I have this time sourced from his biographers. You can read the book, you can read it in there yourself. His time of birth was 8:19 a.m., which subsequently sounds like April 19, which if you know, you know. Okay? Described as shy and withdrawn, but also outgoing and playful. He was Gemini rising. His rising's ruled by Mercury. His sun, Taurus, ruled by Venus, which was debilitated. In conjunct Saturn. In its fall. Are you kidding me? He struggled to relate to his mother. He also experienced an injury in childhood. I actually believe several injuries. If you want to know more about that, read the biography. He developed an early interest in computing and coding. Again, we saw this in Mangione. We've seen a lot of engineering stuff coming up here, whether it's through bomb making or conventional education in engineering or engineering prison escapes like Ted Bundy. He developed an early interest in firearms. That says firearms and firearms. Okay, so I guess that reflects his love for gun culture in the United States. He enlisted in the United States Army. Again, we're seeing another theme here with this military experience. He was deployed to Iraq for Operation Desert Storm in 1991, and he was a top-scoring gunner on a Bradley tank. He had confirmed kills in combat, so before he became the Oklahoma City bomber, or the main perpetrator in the Oklahoma City bombing, he had confirmed kills as a soldier. And he was awarded a Bronze Star for this war contribution. He engaged in sexual relations with his friends' wives. Again, we've seen this come up a little bit, whether it's sexual licentiousness, or confusion over sexuality, or prostitution, or men who, in their crimes, are murdering prostitutes. There was a couple there, you know, or maybe for someone like Manson, who he maybe had a couple of these young people in Haight-Ashbury who were following him, who were engaged in these kinds of things. He himself experienced substance abuse. He used methamphetamine. Want to know more about that? Read the biography. He became enraged by the ATF during their siege and fire on Koresh and his following. Also the FBI as well, but primarily the ATF. He really didn't like the ATF. Supposedly masterminded, if you know, you know, and perpetrated the Oklahoma City bombing. Again, like Yusuf, he made explosives and loaded them into a rental truck, and this killed 168 people on the 19th of April, 1995. So we've seen this come up as well, with executions. Unlike the other ones that we've seen, McVeigh waived his appeals, and he settled with capital punishment. He wanted to die, and he became the first execution in the United States altogether since 1963. So, beautiful time chart we have here. Look at this. It's nice and organized. I really like looking at it. I think it's a really good example. We're going to talk about this a bit later when we talk about Lilly's accidental and essential debilities and dignities with our 11th and our 12th house. He was talking about the cadent and the fixed houses having different planetary, creating or invoking different planetary conditions. And you can see, we see it here with the third house as well. We're going to talk about this aspect, this nice clean aspect here, this trine between his sun, or is it his Mercury? I think it was both of them. No, that's Mercury. Mercury trine Jupiter. Okay? Really interesting. And although we can't see as much of a planetary influence as we have with Mangione to do with this technological interest, all three of his outer planets are in retrograde. Again, if any astrologers out there is interested in this kind of stuff, you might want to look at this. Might want to see if there's any themes that you can pick out of that. So for our additional identifiers, we have a Mars in detriment, right here in Taurus. We have a Saturn in sign of fall, right here in Aries, and yes, it is in conjunct his debilitated Venus. Incredible. Incredible. I mean, his ascendant ruler debilitated in conjunct his Saturn in sign of fall. And his, we're gonna talk about this later, his ascendant rules combust within 2 degrees. And, again, it's trined his insect Jupiter. Amazing. I love this chart. Okay, cool themes. Injury in childhood. Technologically adept. He had an interest in this stuff. Military experience, radical ideology. Sexual licentiousness. He wasn't a very loyal friend, despite having a lot of 11th house activity. But again, hey, that was that in conjunction between a debilitated Venus and a Saturn in fall. So, to me, that explains it. But that's just me. And one of them was his, the ruler of his sun. Okay? Psychological distress. A lot of people say that he was a disgruntled veteran. I think he maybe disagreed with this a little bit, but he's not here to tell me to stop, so fuck you. He committed several murders, bombings, and he was the first person federally executed in a while. He's a notorious crime figure, and he changed history, which he indeed did. Okay. Because McVeigh's chart is the only time one, we are using it as an example to refer to our other Einstein charts and see if it can provide answers for whether or not a Venusian debilitation has any influence on criminality within this context. His nativity provides great parallels to all Venusian debilitation examples within the context of criminality. So again, we're looking for these similar themes in untimed charts to essential fortitude or debility and accidental fortitude or debility according to the post-classical work of William Lilly. I will also again briefly touch on the stellar influences laid out by Reinhold Eberton as it corresponds to McVeigh's time chart. Okay, so Besiegement right here. Lilly says that besieged planet is when it's trapped between the malefics. Incredible. We have a Mars debilitated in Taurus, and then we have a Saturn in its sign of fall in Aries. Incredible. This exemplifies besiegement. Incredible. That right here. His Venus, his Mercury, and his Sun are besieged via the malefics. Keeping in mind that his Mars is in detriment and his Saturn is in its fall. We also have a besieged Venus that's simultaneously in detriment and in conjunct his Saturn in fall. Incredible. All of his planets in essential dignity are also subject to accidental debility through besiegement. One of them's his ascendant ruler, right here. And again, it's the combust the sun. We're going to see this come up a bit later. And then we also have his sun ruler, Venus here, debilitated, in conjunct Saturn. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Okay, parallel to Kaczynski's chart, I'm going to be laying out all the parallels from our untimed charts. His Mars is in its fall, squared his Venus in detriment. So we see here, besieged. Mercury, sun ruler, and his Jupiter in detriment. Incredible. We saw this similar with Tim, with his sun ruler and his Saturn in fall. We're seeing it here with Kaczynski right now. Besieged Mercury sun ruler in conjunct a debilitated. Oh, sorry, was it in fall? Yeah, no, it's besieged. I think it's debilitated through Gemini. Incredible, incredible. His Mercury and Jupiter are besieged while his Jupiter is debilitated and Mercury is domiciled. Amazing. Parallels to Yusuf's chart, as I was saying. We're seeing this theme. These people who crossed paths, okay? McVeigh, Kaczynski, and Yusuf all served time in a federal institution, in the same building, on the same tier. on the same fucking celebrity row, and we're seeing exactly the same besiegement. And it's in the same order. We have a Saturn, and then we have a Mars. It's in this same order. Mars up here, Mars down here, Saturn up here. Incredible. His Saturn is in its fall, same as McVeigh, which is in conjunct. It's not a very close conjunction, but it's still in conjunct his debilitated Venus, and his Mars is debilitated through Taurus. We saw this exact same thing with McVeigh. Different. Here we have a retrograde Venus. We didn't see that with McVeigh. But again, we have his Sun ruler debilitated in conjunct, and it's besieged a planet in its fall, and we also have a planet that's debilitated, and it's his Sun ruler. And his Sun is one of the besieged planets. Incredible. His besieged Venus is simultaneously debilitated, and his moon may be exalted. Again, very small window we're dealing with here. Oh, sorry, no, it's not. We're dealing with a larger window for an exaltation of the luminary. Not so much gonna worry about that. You know, I'm not any other astrologers. They might be into that kind of stuff, but hey, again, we're dealing with this exact same thing. Very similar to McVeigh. Kind of similar to Kaczynski in the same way that the malefics are ordered from Saturn up here to Mars down here. And of course, this would be different if these were timed. It could be we could have a Mars that's in a more higher position than a Saturn. But again, we just got to deal with what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the information we've got. Okay. So, Katherine Knight's chart. Again, we have a Saturn that's above the Mars. Besieged Venusian fixed water scorpionic debilitation. We have the Sun and we have Mercury. We've seen consistently. Sun is besieged via the malefics. We've also seen it come up with Mercury quite a bit. We saw it come up with Kaczynski. We saw it come up with McVeigh. Can't remember if we saw it with Yusuf, even though I was just looking at the chart, but you want to see it, go back and look at it. And we're still, again, dealing with these Venusian debilities. This is just different modality. But again, these actually aren't in conjunct. This Saturn and Venus. But the Saturn's not even under any condition. Lilly actually had a word for this. I can't remember what he called it when a planet wasn't under any particular condition. But we're not worrying about those anyway. So her Mars is debilitated in conjunct her besieged Mercury. So we're seeing this again. We're seeing with these besieged malefics, they're besieging these planets, and our Mars and our Saturn have come up consistently with one or another essential debility. Wow. And we're also seeing that with Venus, and we're seeing the Sun and Mercury consistently besieged, while her Sun and debilitated Venus are simultaneously besieged again. We're seeing that. That's a theme. Okay. So now we're dealing with combustion. So we can see here again, a planet considered weakened or debilitated if it's within 8 degrees of the Sun, or 8.5 if you want to go technical. His Mercury is combust, but there is no correspondence to Venus. So yes, his Venus is besieged, his Venus is debilitated, but it's not combust. Again, I mean, it's still interesting, and we're going to see that come up quite a bit. Remembering that his Sun and Mercury are besieged, his Mars is debilitated, and his debilitated Venus is in conjunct his Saturn in fall. Okay? Very, very, very interesting. So now let's examine some of our untimed charts, and we're going to look for combustion and Venus correspondence, which we won't really see. Again here, Kaczynski's chart. His Saturn is combust his Sun within a degree in his Gemini stellium, but no correspondence to Venus. Same with McVeigh. And they were under the same roof as well. El Chapo as well. He was in the same institution. McVeigh wasn't there when he was there, but Yusuf and Kaczynski were there when he was there, when he was sentenced. So we see here, this actually does have a correspondence to Venus, to his Venusian debilitation, because his Sun is exalted via Aries, and it's within a 2-degree conjunction, and it's combusting his debilitated cardinal fire Venus. So then here, Mangione. Again, we had his Mars that's debilitated via his sun sign, and it's in conjunct within 2 degrees with his sun in Taurus, but no correspondence to his debilitated Venus. So we've seen that with Kaczynski and McVeigh as well. And Mangione, he made comments on Kaczynski's work. I don't know if he made comments on any of the other people, but he definitely made comments on Kaczynski. Okay, Charles Manson. So like El Chapo, we see his sun ruler that's debilitating the sign that governs his sun, debilitating his Venus that's also combust simultaneously within a degree. We saw this exact same thing with El Chapo. Exact same thing, just different sign. Different, we're dealing with the different sign-based debility here. And then Ted Bundy. So his Mercury's combust, but no correspondence to Venus. So we're seeing this theme. While there are planets combust, some of them have correspondence to debilitated Venus, some of them don't. Here, we don't have any condition. Mercury isn't under any condition here. But like McVeigh, his Mercury was combust too. Only difference is here with Bundy, his Mercury is in retrograde motion through Scorpio. Very interesting, okay? And these are 2 signs doing these. So, I don't know if I just said that it was sun ruler, but it's not for him because his sun's in Sag. So, this actually isn't a very close conjunction, but, you know, it is still combust. And it's retrograde Mercury that's right there next to within 4 degrees of his debilitated Venus that's also in retrograde motion. Okay, so now we're doing Lilly. He talks about accidental debility and fortitude according to house placement. So he says that a planet's power and influence change depending on which of the 12 houses it occupies. So he says the Caden houses, he says that these are considered the weakest, that they have the least influence. Very interesting, considering what we're going to see come up for a planet. He describes the planets in these houses as poor and of little efficacy. Again, they have little influence. He says that the 12th, so this is the house that traditionally rules the subconscious or hidden matters. McVeigh's 12th house is heavy in his cosmological constitution. Here we have his Mars debilitated. We also have his Sun, and it's in conjunct a combust Mercury, which is his ascendant ruler. Very heavy for him. So the 3rd, this is corresponding. His Sun and his Venus are his Sun and his Mercury corresponding to his Jupiter in Sect. Very interesting. So 3rd house, communication, learning matters. His insect Jupiter in here is trined 12th house to his sun, and I actually see that aspect as it's aspecting Mercury, but it might have said sun in the software. So pressure, apparently, according to the Hellenistic astrologers, pressure here is released from birth between the besieged sun and insect Jupiter for him because his benefic Jupiter is insect. So how could this play out in terms of his criminality? Someone want to brainstorm that. Very interesting. Additionally, with the succedent houses, so 2nd, 5th, 8th, and 12th, so these govern the fixed signs, these represent where we secure, build, and maintain value. And again, his 11th house, very heavy in his cosmological constitution. His 11th and 12th houses, they correspond thoroughly through besiegement, combustion, sect, and the core Ptolemaic conditions, as I described. We have his Mars that's debilitated via his sun ruler, and his sun is combusting his ascendant ruler. And then the sign that rules his sun sign is debilitated simultaneously in conjunct his Saturn, which is in its fall. Incredible. So, his Saturn is in full conjunct his debilitated Venus in the 11th, and his Mercury is also besieged and in combust his 11th. And it's his ascendant ruler, remember that. While Tim has an essentially dignified Mars. Venus and Saturn, the influence of accidental dignity in terms of house placement and besiegement, has also brought his Sun and Mercury, which is ascendant ruler, into the mix. So these are within a 2-degree conjunction again. So that's actually not essentially dignified Mars. Oh wait, no, according to the accidental debility or fortitude, according to house placement, they are. Because I laid that out in the beginning of the video, because Lilly says that 12th house placements have accidental debility and 11th and 3rd house placements have accidental fortitude. So again, like with this 12th house influence, so we see one planet here that's already in essential debility, but then it also has accidental debility via its house placement. And then with the 11th. So he says that 11th and 3rd house placements have accidental fortitude, but again, we're dealing with an inconjunct ascendant ruler and an in-4 Mars. And his ascendant ruler, his sun ruler is debilitated. So really interesting. It's deep. So McVeigh's chart is the only time chart. We cannot use this as an example to compare with other charts. We cannot do that. They are untimed. We're not being irresponsible. Lilly says that placements in the cadent houses have little influence, but are also accidental in debility. Okay, interesting, because remember, his cadent 12th house, very, very influential for some of the other characteristics that Lilly outlined, and also in his own cosmology, very influential. So, again, this is interesting, considering what we've seen so far, how McVeigh's 12th house placements correspond with his 11th. Because Lilly, he says that the cadent houses have little influence, but there's accidental debility involved. There's accidental fortitude involved. His Jupiter was in Sect. 3rd house cadent, accidental fortitude. Very interesting. So now we're dealing with the Oriental and Occidental and Sect. According to Ptolemy's Tetrabiblios, Venus in an Aries or Scorpio placement forces her to operate under martial conditions rather than her own Venusian ones. This can cause the native to prioritize their own independence, there's some selfishness, leading to relational friction. We've seen that. We've seen that come up, not even only with McVeigh's chart, but we've seen it come up with other charts. And again, we can't use Sect. We can't use Oriental or Occidental. We can't even use the house placement, accidental fortitude or debility. We can't do that. We don't have any other time charts. We're not fucking with that. We're not being irresponsible. No thank you. But it is possible that there could be contrast with what's going on here and the other charts. Very interesting. So, the thrill and chase of immediate excitement over long-term diplomacy, short-term gratification. In my opinion, McVeigh definitely experienced this throughout his life. Immediate excitement. That probably was something that came up for him with his military experience. And again, we saw very, very interesting consistency with a couple of these charts with their Venusian debility. They had military experience as well. So this is just very interesting, okay? We must consider the condition of Mars because of this, because of these Venusian abilities, okay? So, Mars rules Aries and Scorpio. Therefore, he acts as the host to Venus, okay? But we're considering McVeigh's cosmological constitution because his Mars is debilitated. It's actually not cardinal phi debilitated. It's fixed Earth debilitated, which is in an applying trine to his insect Jupiter. Interesting. But his Mars and Jupiter are Oriental, giving both accidental fortitude. So this this adds comprehensivity to what we're dealing with here, according to the post-classical accidental and essential debilities and dignities according to house placement and the Oriental or Occidental position and sect as a fundamental basis. Very, very detailed. His chart is diurnal, therefore benefic Jupiter rather than benefic Venus, and his malefic Saturn rather than malefic Mars have sect authority. His sun is above the horizon, therefore his Jupiter and his Saturn are in an excellent position. But remember the condition of his Mars, and remember the conditions of his Jupiter via aspect, and that 3rd house cadent influence that had accidental fortitude according to Lilly. Fascinating. Oriental. Remember, a planet that is behind the sun or right of the sun. These planets are associated with active, assertive, and initiating energy, and his Venus and Saturn are Occidental, which gives his Venus accidental fortitude. But his Venus was in a really shitty position. It was in a shitty position, and remember, his Jupiter is benefic in Sect. That's a bad Venus, and it's his sun ruler. Incredible. But then we have our Occidental, okay? So a planet that is before or left of the sun. These planets are considered more receptive, reflexive, and inward moving, noting that his moon is in an applying sextile with his Mars, and it's Occidental. Okay? So we're dealing with a diurnal chart here because it's in Sect Jupiter. So the Sect chart has been determined. This now dictates whether a planet's are in power. Okay, are they allies or are they challengers? Well, we can see his Venus is a challenge for him, his Mars is a challenge for him, whereas his Jupiter and Saturn are his allies, but they themselves are in very interesting positions, particularly his Saturn. His Jupiter was a bit better off there, but we were dealing with a combust ascendant ruler in conjunct his Sun. And he's the ruler of his Sun, debilitated in conjunct a Saturn in fall. Fascinating. So daytime benefic Jupiter and the daytime malefic is Saturn. Remembering the conditions of his Sun and Jupiter, they were in a trine, and his Saturn, his Mars was aspected his Jupiter as well. I believe anyway. At least that's what I said here. I didn't didn't actually take note of that in the casted chart, but it's fine. Shh, don't tell him. Okay. Benefic insect. A daytime Jupiter is extremely well supported, and a malefic insect, a daytime Saturn, brings difficulties, but these challenges can be constructed and can be structured and predictable. Interesting. No other time charts. Although Oriental and Occidental conditions can be observed with untimed charts, we cannot assume houses because that's irresponsible. Fuck that. I get too much shit wrong already. I'm not getting that fucking shit wrong. Hell no. No concept of sect can be considered because we don't have any houses. We don't know whether or not the sun is positioned above or below the ascendant-descendant axis. This situation makes it more difficult to contrast, but hey, the parallel that came up most was Kaczynski's chart. And they were under the same roof for a brief period of time. So we're going to look and we're going to see. Remember, we can't assume houses. It's untimed. I'm not fucking with that. But we're still going to consider it for how it could apply to the other untimed charts. Remembering that Lilly says that Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars when Oriental are accidentally fortituded. They're accidental dignified. And Mercury, Venus, when Occidental are in accidental fortitude. They're accidentally dignified. Whereas Saturn, Jupiter, Mars when Occidental are accidentally debilitated, and Mercury and Venus when Oriental are accidentally debilitated, okay? So, remember, we're dealing with an untimed chart. We can't assume this. However, like McVeigh, in Kaczynski's chart, a debilitated Venus is Oriental. But we're assuming this because we don't know which sign governs his ascendant. McVeigh's Mars is debilitated. Kaczynski's Mars is in its fall, in Cancer. His Jupiter is also Occidental, okay? Whereas Kaczynski's is debilitated. McVeigh's is in Sect. Kaczynski could very well be in Sect as well. I don't know. We can't assume houses, but it's still interesting to think about. Fascinating. How might this, just brainstorm for a second, how might this correspond to the other charts we've seen with consistent Venusian debilitations, whether it be via cardinal fire or fixed water? Because holy shit, this could, if these other charts were timed, this could very well come up. And it's fascinating. So now we're going to go into a little bit of Everton, alright? We're not going to go too much into this, but it's just something to think about when we're considering how planets influence each other, how they correspond, how they communicate, what is their relationship in the nativity, okay? So because of the strengths and weaknesses that we've observed so far via classical, and core, as a result, post-classical, essential, debilities and dignities, we're going to look for Venus, Saturn, Mercury, and Sun, as well as Mars and Jupiter combinations. According to Everton, this is just one contemporary interpretation, okay? So, McVeigh's Sun and Mercury correspondence. Remember, his Mercury was combust via his Sun, and his Mercury was his ascendant ruler, so this is big, okay? And we saw that trine. I think one was a minor aspect, but we did see two trines via his Sun Mercury and his insect Jupiter. So, Everton says, Sun and Mercury has a negative psychological correspondence that invokes lack of clarity and aimlessness. By the way, if you want to read this stuff, read it in his book called Stellar Combinations. I just picked out the most relevant. He says other things as well, but these were the most relevant. He also says that Sun to Mercury correspondence has positive psychological correspondence that invokes consciousness of objective. That sounds like McVeigh. He knew what he wanted. and he got exactly what he wanted. Sun and Jupiter correspondence. Remember, his Jupiter's in Sect, and there was a trine with his Sun, which was combusting his ascendant ruler, and they were both besieged, along with his Sun ruler, besieged in conjunct his Saturn in 4. Incredible. Everton says that Sun to Jupiter correspondence has negative psychological correspondence that invokes arrogance, pretentiousness, and conflict with the law. A lawless individual, someone who does not care about their reputation, someone who does not care about jeopardizing their physical freedom. They want what they want. They have anger, they have animosity, and they want to exercise their mind, Mercury, to get it. And he got it. He says that positive psychological correspondence of Sun and Jupiter invokes the will for expansion. He literally made a bomb in a fucking truck. Expansion, okay? He says that it manifests sociologically as people of prominence. Remember, we're dealing with high-profile criminality. Mercury and Jupiter correspondence according to Everton. Remember, there was that trine. One was a minor aspect, I can't remember exactly, okay, but we had a combust Mercury, ascendant ruler, combust via the Sun, and his Sun ruler was debilitated via cardinal fire Aries, and it's in conjunct, he's Saturn 4. Besieged. It's just incredible, okay? He says that Mercury-Jupiter correspondence has negative psychological correspondence, invoking mischievousness, exaggerated representations, self-conceit, or arrogance. He says that Mercury to Jupiter correspondence has positive psychological correspondence that invokes a wealth of ideas, a gift of speech, and an active mind. And we've seen that come up with some other charts as well. The charismatic leader, Charles Manson. The gift of speech. We've seen that come up a little bit with Ted Bundy as well. And we've also seen it come up with Mangione. Alright, so now we're dealing with Venus and Saturn correspondence. Okay, remember, they were in conjunct. His Venus was debilitated, his Saturn was in 4. His Venus is his Sun ruler, which combust his ascendant ruler. Everton says that Venus to Saturn correspondence has negative psychological correspondence, invoking emotional inhibitions, a state of dissatisfaction, and unhealthy expression of sexual urges, self-torment, and hard-heartedness. He says that the positive psychological correspondence invokes a sense of duty, military sense of duty. He says that the sociological correspondence manifests as lonely people who are inspired by a great sense of duty. Again, this duty that's coming up with Saturn, the values, the morals, the aesthetics coming up with Venus in conjunct. One's debilitated, one's in 4. He says that the probable manifestations of this combination include difficulties in love and the separation from the mother. Both of these things happened during his life, as we saw with these themes that were coming up as well. Alright? Last slide. It's been over an hour. If you made it this far, thank you. I appreciate you. Concluding remarks. Venusian debilitations appear somewhat routinely in the nativity of high-profile criminals. We still can't say a clear distinction between whether it's fixed water debility or cardinal fire debility. You could maybe piece that together yourself a little bit. Not to say that Venusian debilitations are a predictor for other planetary conditions with classical or post-classical frameworks, but they do appear to come up alongside it to varying levels. We saw that. We saw some martial exaltations. We saw some martial falls. We saw some things going on with the luminaries. We saw different Saturn conditions. We saw different Sun conditions. We saw different Venusian conditions. We saw when we were talking about Besiegement. Sorry, no, Combustion. Some of them had correspondences to debilitated Venus, some of them didn't. Okay? So there's no precise consistency of these outside of Venusian debilities. That's why I'm here. It's why I'm making this video. I noticed a consistency with Venusian debilities, but there's no precise consistency with any other planetary, essential, dignity, or debility, whether it's classical or post-classical. Okay? The essential debility invokes within the native themes of sexual licentiousness, childhood trauma, delinquency, substance abuse, feelings of inferiority, novel intellectual experience, or intellectual dishonesty. Murder for self-perceived necessities to defend oneself or satiate one's destructive desires. Psychological distress, cynicism, network associations, and perhaps an overall stellar predisposition to alter history. We saw that consistently. People who change history to varying levels. What those varying levels are determined by, we need other astrologers to work on this. Okay, because I've only noticed a Venusian debilitation, whether it's fixed water or cardinal fire. But again, no precise consistency of other essential debilities or dignity. Okay. Individual themes appear with poor relationships or no relationships with guardians, so the parents, evading responsibility or prison escapes, calculated or manipulative individuals, jeopardizing their physical freedom with little regard for their reputation or well-being, childhood injury, varying interests in technology, whether it's a disdain for such or an engineering degree, and displeasure or instability with the opposite sex. Okay, very interesting. Natal charts of individuals who cross paths or have the same generational planetary influence have more parallels to certain planetary conditions. We saw that. We saw that. I feel I've explained that very well, okay? And if I haven't, go back and listen again. Or your astrology should be able to see it, okay? Differences between how Venusian debilitations play out for males and females. I talked about this a bit. We saw with our male criminals. Some of them had animosity for the opposite sex, and some of them had their crimes directed towards satiating that animosity, okay? Same with our females, the two female charts we had. One was cardinal fire Venusian debility, the other one was fixed water. And we saw both of these women, their crimes had to do with expressing a hatred for men. Some of these males exercise disdain for women through their crimes, while the females exercise disdain for males through their crimes, but limited female charts, okay? That's another thing you need to consider. Differences contrasting cardinal fire Venusian debilitations compared to fixed water debilitations. Again, it's not exactly clear to me right now about how this is going to look. I think it says more about the individual than it does whether or not Venus is debilitated via fixed water or cardinal fire, but the effects appear to be more demanding through cardinal fire debilitation, and that's really all we can say for sure from this, okay? That disproportionately we saw more cardinal fire Venusian debilitations than fixed water. Venusian debilitations in the nativity of high-profile criminals does not appear to emerge without additional dignities and debilities from classical or post-classical conditions, okay? And the traditions that constitute those conditions. So again, one chart may have had yes, they all had Venusian debilities, but not all of them had a Saturn in its fall. Some of them have an exalted Saturn, some of them had a domiciled Saturn, some had exalted Mars, some had debilitated Mars, some had Mars in fall, okay? Some had Sun in its fall, okay? But there's no other clear consistency outside of Venus, according to these charts. Appears consistently through additional planetary conditions with military or academic experience. These are the things we consistently identified via these additional planetary conditions. Weak, absent, or abusive fathers, or weak, absent, or unstable mothers, and varying levels of notoriety and influence in popular culture. I hope you enjoyed. Okay? Very interesting stuff. This should not be overlooked. This is very important. This is exceptionally important. If you're an astrologer, you should be able to see that, okay? I truly believe that. If you can't see it, you're not looking hard enough. Alright? God bless.